Hello, I'm Gus Sarkicarella, student of the flesh and its many mysteries.
And I am Henry Galley, a child of the Mechanites, and from the moment that I understood the weakness of my flesh, I learned to despise it.
And together, we are not alive, but we are also here to secure, contain, and protect.
Yeah, baby.
It seemed like you all really liked our last SCP video, and we had a few other ideas for talking about the SCP universe that we're just gonna go ahead and shotgun right now because it seems like there's clearly a demand for it.
Today we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the lore of the SCP Foundation, and specifically its world building, because we looked into it and were really shocked to see that there aren't a lot of people discussing the SCP Foundation and its lore through this sort of analytical, creative dimension on YouTube.
Yeah, honestly, I think that that's, in a way, one of the strengths of the SCP Foundation is that you don't need to know the deeper lore of the setting in order to get something out of each of the individual articles, but at the same time, I'm sure that people would love to hear about it.
Even if you're not super into the SCP Foundation and you're more here on this channel for mine and Gus or any of the other contributors discussing our thoughts on writing and internet creativity, this video is also for you, because in discussing the key thing, the secret ingredient that makes the SCP Foundation work, we think we're going to impart what we believe to be a valuable lesson that you can apply to your own projects, whether you are creating your own shows or books, whether you're someone who just world builds for the fun of it, or if maybe you're DMing some kind of like TTRPG campaign and are looking for a way to spice up your world. Because to us, after a lot of behind-the-scenes discussion, we think the thing that makes the SCP Foundation world feel both as big and as immersive as it does, beyond the anti-memes and the cognito hazards and the mobile task forces and the Ketas and the Euclids and all that, is the groups of interest. What are they, Gus?
Well, so groups of interest are essentially the factions of this fictional world that is parallel to our own, with the exception of a few things that are not like our own. I say a few things. There's
over 8,000 of these things.
Yeah, more than the Pokemon, for sure more than the Pokemon. But these are called anomalies, and the SCP Foundation classifies them through numbers as SCPs. But they exist innumerably throughout this entire universe beyond what the Foundation has been able to capture. And they're not the only people out there who have access to these anomalies, or are creating them, or have a completely different take from the Foundation on what is to be done about the existence of anomalies. So that's where you get your groups of interest, and they are all strange and different.
That there are so many of them at this point that the SCP Wiki, which I definitely recommend you go check out after this video for further reading, has two different pages, one for the more well-known ones, which we're drawing from here, and one for the real weird, obscure ones. And this isn't going to be a listicle, we're going to be sort of bringing up a bunch of different ones throughout to discuss with reference to how they really liven up and enrich the SCP universe. But believe me when I say, this thing is a rabbit hole that you can get lost down, and at the end of the video we're going to be sort of discussing some of our favorite, said lovingly, freak shit groups, which are the really strange, miscellaneous ones that, like Marge's potatoes, we just think are kinda neat. But we first want to talk a little bit about how these groups of interest, how these factions, if we want to talk a more sort of general approach to fiction, make the world feel bigger. And I think part of it is, Gus, have you ever noticed that there is sometimes a problem in more amateurish pieces of fiction where it feels almost as though the entire fictional world exists purely through the main characters or main group of characters in like a weirdly solipsistic fashion?
Yes, well that, I think, it can go that way, or it can be combined with this idea of there are the good guys and the bad guys. And these like two major forces are clashing, and that's what the story is about. But I think if your world is based on like some kind of tangible speculative element or a magic system or like just a bizarre land, you're gonna run into people who disagree with each other on lines different from whether or not they're positioned as the hero protagonist, using those terms loosely, versus villain antagonist roles in the thing. Because I think it makes it feel more fleshed out if there is conflict that doesn't come from relative storytelling positioning and instead comes from the people in the world forming coalitions and being like, this is our agenda and goal based on what we observe within the fiction.
I think you really hit on something there as well with this moral framing aspect too, because this idea of absolute good and absolute evil, while it can work if something for younger readers is what you have in mind, it can make your fictional world feel really flat if we have our dogged good guys going up against the Dark Lord. And part of what makes the SCP Foundation, which is to say the in-universe organization, so interesting is that through a mix of its interactions with these other groups of interest and the lack of canon, it exists in a much more ambiguous state. While it can be said that generally across canons, the Foundation is, on the whole, a force for good, and even if they sometimes do bad things or mess up, they, on the whole, want what is right for humanity and consensus normality and all that. But when we start looking at the other groups of interest around them, you see really interesting patterns emerge with how their approaches differ and what that says about the Foundation. Which brings us into this first grouping of factions, which I like to kind of call the Foundation-likes, which are things that could be broadly said to have similar goals to the Foundation in combating or acting against the force of anomalies, but doing it in a way that has differing methods or ideologies or allegiances from how the Foundation does it. And I think the biggest one that you're most likely to hear brought up in these conversations is the Global Occult Coalition, or GOC.
Yeah, and what I like about the GOC and some of these other ones is that when we're talking about a Foundation-like faction, the Foundation's goal has always been to secure, contain, and protect. It's in the name, but that does make them very morally limber, as Henry was getting into, where it's like, is containing these things good or bad? The GOC, in contrast, is all about destroying things, which kind of immediately makes them a little bit more morally dark, because to destroy something is to remove it irrevocably from the world. And I think by including them, you immediately see a more positive, in contrast side of the SCP Foundation, but crucially, it doesn't make the SCP Foundation the good guys, it just kind of draws out a different reflection of them.
And we get to sort of cut this both ways, because we have the most famous examples of times where the Foundation philosophy of contain versus the GOC's philosophy of destroy has shaken out in favor of the Foundation's perspective, like SCP-1609, Remains of a Chair, which was a sentient teleporting chair that would just teleport behind you when you needed a place to sit, and it was kind of wholesome, not hurting anyone, but still anomalous. The GOC captured it and put it through a wood chipper to destroy it, and now, out of a sense of vengeance, it's this pile of wood chips that when a person comes near, it teleports into their lungs and kills them. There's a really bizarre comparison, but it's a kind of like Daredevil and the Punisher is the dynamic that they have with each other.
Yeah, it really is. I love the GOC in that whatever they're up to, it does reinforce a very core component of the SCP across its many canons. Because I remember there was an article about basically like words of advice for new people adding SCPs, which, hey, you can still do. If you're listening to this, feel free to take a crack at it and write an SCP at some point. But crucially, this article was saying while destruction logs work for something like 682, which is a very dangerous monster that like constantly breaks containment, you shouldn't just have destruction logs for like any old given thing, because there is no one of the 3 letters in the SCP Foundation's name that is destroy. And if you're going to write an article, you need more than just, we put this weird sphere in a vat of acid and tried to destroy it.
Wasn't there a rule at some point that was like, no more spheres? We've had enough.
That was from that same article as that, like, please stop doing spheres. Please stop doing anomalous spheres. It's do anything else, any other kind of anomaly that is in a different geometric shape.
Oh, that's so funny. But that's the thing, yeah, the GOC works as this great foil because with it being the kind of UN answer to the ambiguously private SCP Foundation, it creates something that's like, okay, well, they have comparable in many of the canons resources, manpower, etc., and we just see the differences in how they approach play out purely philosophically. But then we have groups like the Unusual Incidents Unit, which is almost a sort of parody of your kind of Mulder and Scully X-Files FBI subdivision that looks into the paranormal and are almost, like, most of the time played as a joke, who are hopelessly under-equipped and inexperienced at dealing with this stuff. And 9 times out of 10, when you see the UIU, it would be like, they found this, were outmatched, and immediately handed it over to the Foundation after several deaths.
Yeah, and like the GOC sort of shows in a grander light the SCP Foundation's preservation instinct, the UIU shows the SCP Foundation to be competent in a grander way.
What you may be noticing here as we go through some of these is one of the greatest benefits of factions in a world-building space is that through comparison, they help you know each other better. This is a kind of group equivalent of a concept that you'll see both in writing. The author of Anatomy of Story, John Truby, talks about this a lot, and in a lot of role-playing games like the Vampire the Masquerade series. It's this idea of the character way. It's we can know a character and know them better and see different sides of them by seeing how they interact differently with different characters. And I think the same is very much true of groups. And I think, it goes towards making this world feel so much bigger, even on the sort of paranormal or like anomalistic containment or destroying squads, when we see that even some, like, international powers have their own equivalents of these. Like, there's the GRU Division P, which is the Soviet SCP Foundation that was active during the Cold War. There's the Imperial Japanese Anomalous Matters Examination Agency, which, as the name suggests, was a very similar thing, working under the auspices of Imperial Japan. And the Organization for the Reclamation of Islamic Artifacts, which is under the Ayatollah in Iran. They were helping to try and get all of the different anomalies that were present in their sort of neck of the woods in the Middle East, bring them under their power, out of both the sense of we don't want our cultural artifacts stolen, whether it's by the SCP Foundation or Hobby Lobby, and this idea of, well, we can, as a nation, consolidate power by having anomalies underneath us, which, again, creates this sense of geopolitical intrigue behind everything that I find fascinating.
Yeah, because I think that, like, while there can be factions with similar goals in your setting, the differences between them that make them distinctive groups can be as, like, seemingly arbitrary as nationality or a different approach to the same goal, in a way that, like the UIU, is slightly more incompetent than the SCP Foundation and kind of refuses help from other groups. That can be why they're a distinct thing. And these other groups obviously have their own agenda backed up by their own national interests that keep them separate from this other stuff. And it also shows the SCP to be sort of impartial to and perhaps above ideas of like nationalism. And I think that again, it's one of those things where it's not just what the goal is and how they go about it. It is these little nuances with how that affects like other things that go on in the world. Who thought this up? What was its like the beginning of its history, and why do they remain set in a certain way?
Yeah, it allows them to do really fascinating kind of alternate history things as well that any sort of history or politics buff out there will find really interesting, like GRU Division P working with the KGB and playing into all of those themes of Cold War paranoia and the superpowers going at each other's throats. And it hints even at real historical stuff because, you know, Gus, as you and me have like looked into just because it personally interests us, the KGB and the CIA were basically trying to harness like psychic powers and magic to get an edge in the Cold War. So it's not even that far from reality in a lot of ways.
Yeah, like if we were living in a world with way more apparent occult elements, you know that those intelligence agencies would have like a huge branch devoted to mastering whatever strange magic systems exist within our cosmos.
When Uri Geller was using his like charlatan powers to bend spoons, there was probably some 5-star military general behind a piece of glass being like, how can we weaponize this? Do you think we could maybe somehow psychically boost his power enough that he could bend the Kremlin? You know,
exactly.
It's how countries work. We need
to feed the Kremlin false information through our spies so that they'll build a giant spoon-shaped building and keep all of their top guys in it.
It just makes me think of, you know, in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, it's like, wait, the entire country is like a giant sigil. Here it's like, wait, no, all of Moscow is a huge spoon. They've directed the planning of it for decades.
They've redrawn the borders to make a spoon.
And Uri Geller's gonna bend it.
That's excellent. Oh my god. Do you know that Uri Geller... Fun fact, do you know that he, at one point, sued Pokemon for making the, like, Kadabra and Alakazam line? Because they were, like, psychic spoon benders?
That's so fun. Wait, he just went all in on spoons. He said to Theresa May, back when she was Prime Minister, to try and stop Brexit, I predicted your rise to power when I showed you Winston Churchill's spoon on my Cadillac, which I asked you to touch. I don't know how it happened that this man was like, yes, I have tremendous psychic powers that can be channeled purely through spoons. Don't ask me anything else.
It is specific and weird enough, and like enough of a hyperfixation that it could be a Jujutsu Kaisen curse technique, which is actually worth talking about because that's another setting that does something similar to the SCP Foundation with its factions. Like, the main one thing that is weird about the Jujutsu Kaisen world is that cursed energy exists, giving rise to cursed spirits, to sorcerers, to cursed techniques. This is not some uniform, like, there's the big bad cursed spirits, and there are the good sorcerers who fight them. There is a lot of different families, factions, groups of interest, if you will. Your world becomes more fascinating the moment you start to introduce people finding the same source of power or source of information and spinning it to their own separate advantages.
I think you're completely right on that, Gus. And it ties well back into these groups of interest because I think philosophy is a big thing that you can explore through factions in your piece of work. Because I don't think there's any group on Earth that doesn't have some kind of belief system. And I think it's really interesting building off that Jujutsu Kaisen idea that we think about a lot as people whose first love will always be Gojo in this bitch of a world. But yeah, no, there are these really interesting approaches to kind of cults and religion in the SCP universe. Because to some, like the Foundation, like all these national groups, to the GOC, to even the lowly Parawatch forums where conspiracy theorists and paranormal enthusiasts try to understand the bizarreness of their world, to all of these people, this energy is either something to be contained or harnessed, but to other groups, it's something to be like revered and worshipped and that fits into their belief system. At the very start of this video, in our introductions, we discussed this fascinating conflict between the Sarkists, or the Sarkics, and the Mechanites, the Church of the Broken God. And what I find so fascinating about this is, well, the Foundation is often used as a framing device for discussing anomalies that touch on the conflict between those two groups. This is two factions that have this really detailed relationship with each other that doesn't even really involve the Foundation that much.
Yeah, exactly. And it's because they are sort of reacting to not just each other, but these grander ideas of what can be done in the world. And it makes me think of a minor detail in the first Pacific Rim movie, which really should be the only Pacific Rim piece of media, but I rest my case. There is a moment later on where we see the bone slums where Charlie Day's character is going to seek Ron Perlman for some advice, and we see these cultists known as the Buenakai, who worship the kaiju, and it's just this kind of throwaway scene, but it shows that while the Jaegers and the kaiju are at war, someone was gonna worship one, if not both of these, because when it comes to natural phenomena and unexplained phenomena, people will try and fill in the gaps, and a lot of the time, it comes down to a religious tradition, a spiritual tradition.
Exactly, and funnily enough, the kaiju and the Jaeger would actually be pretty good sort of metonyms for the Sarkics and the Church of the Broken God, with there being that
You're right.
that natural conflict, because Sarkicism is kind of all about flesh, it's all about disease, it's all about, again, if you're a Magnus Archives fan, as we often bring up in these videos, it falls under that umbrella of the sort of the corruption and the flesh. But what's really interesting as well is they differ beyond just the classic organic artificial dichotomy to the fact that the Sarkists have this very might makes right, very unstructured, decentralized. They don't really worship their gods. In fact, they're kind of Christ prophet figure, Grand Carcist Ion, is famous for sort of subjugating the gods under his own will, and by contrast, a lot of the groups of the Church of the Broken God are much more into dogma. They're a much more structured thing of vertical power. They have these similar prophet figures, I believe, in Robert Bamaro, but I find it really interesting how these factions are such a gateway into really granular world building where you could get into stuff like, well, not only why are these guys enemies, but why do they think that their way of running the show and their way of winning and living is better than the other guys?
Yeah, because it's not just the powers they command. Sometimes it's the architecture of how they command them through belief, through tradition, through interconnection. And the more you can drill down into those little details, the deeper the wedge you can drive between two factions who really dislike each other, or even two factions who are basically neutral with each other. The Sarkists and the Mechanites are not on good terms with the SCP Foundation, but they are so distinctly different that you could not mistake one for the other.
Exactly, because a general great piece of writing advice, whether it's for character, location, faction in this case, is if ever you have two things that are too similar, you're always better off consolidating them into one thing. But I think what unites so many of the groups we've talked about in this so far is that they are these really unique, kind of irreplaceable things that give these fascinating, unique perspectives, as well as having different strange anomalies connected to them. And the thing is, there is a huge number of sort of religious groups that we haven't even discussed yet that exist in the Foundation world. There's the Church of the Fifth, or the Fiftists, which are some of the more strange and hard to explain, but it's based around sort of patterns and symbology and semiotics. And this thing that I read it out to Gus before we recorded, but there's actually a quote about the Church of the Fifth in their description on the main group of interest page that I have to read out just because I think this is a wonderful bit of satirical prose. It says, "This church is to other churches what clowns are to people. There are some superficial similarities, but all the wrong things are being emphasized and exaggerated, so you can't quite put your finger on what is wrong. And not only, I think, is that really intriguing for a group of interest that is varied enough that it can contain both of like a VW van that goes into space with a bunch of hippies on it and a nightmarish flesh curse pickup artist bimbofication grimoire. I think it's in itself a really good piece of advice in where to start when you make fictional factions.
I also think what's really interesting about the Church of the Fifth, and I think this can spread out to constructing any kind of fantasy or sci-fi or simply speculative religion, is that you can have the higher truth that they're aiming at, but you can also play with the idea of a completely like sort of lopsided, bizarre hierarchy that doesn't necessarily reflect everything from the top. And I'm not just saying like a boilerplate corrupt church archetype. What I'm saying is even within many real-world religions, there exists stuff like blasphemies and apocryphas, things that are anathema to the faith, but are part of it because they have been declared and spoken on by the higher powers of the church. A sin is a sin because it's been declared to be a sin. And so if you play around with that architecture, you can get really, really fascinating like beliefs that beg really interesting questions about how they came to be.
Yeah, I completely agree, man. And I think the SCP Foundation canon is something that does this really well by acknowledging that just like real religions, none of these groups are a monolith. They're all broken down into different movements and sects, some of which have entirely different approaches to these things. Like, for example, the Church of the Broken God is actually its two main sects, which are split down the middle, is one half of the church is a big believer in transcendence through sort of analog technology. You know, these guys are turning themselves into cyborgs. They're like getting the sort of Fallout Brotherhood of Steel power armor and things like that, and cybernetic implants. Whereas the other half believe in technological transcendence through the kind of leaving of the human body through the digital singularity into cyberspace. And these two groups have like a very contentious relationship in that they have these related but at the same time completely different paths to paradise.
Yeah, and that gets into a little bit of like the RPG type stuff, because you can totally see this being like an inter-coven battle, like with vampires and Vampire the Masquerade, or like, you know, maybe there are two like factions of wizards that dislike each other within the more like magic side of the world. Like, just because there is a core base foundation and some common enemies doesn't mean that everybody within a given group is going to get along, or that, you know, eventually those differences won't give rise to splitting of these different groups and create splinter organizations.
It's true. And I think that's something that a lot of people make the mistake of oversimplifying in their work. Recently, I've been rewatching the first few seasons of Game of Thrones, which is kind of like watching old home movies of someone who had a horrific death and being like, oh, they were nice, weren't they, when they were around? Um, but
Oh.
but a big thing that makes those things work is that while you can broadly say that the Lannisters are definitely on the more evil side of things and the Starks are more on the good side, through all of the different houses and the complexities of that early Game of Thrones world building before everything went off the rails, it creates that sense of wonderful moral ambiguity we were talking about from the start. And I want to clarify something here, because ironically, people can be weirdly black and white about moral ambiguity, and moral ambiguity
Yep.
means more more than everything sucks. Like, everyone is kind of shitty and evil. So
Yeah.
this, you know...
It doesn't mean that there is no right thing to do ever, and you might as well not try. It means that there is something more to our actions in a moral ambiguity sense. Like, there has to be something else underpinning it than this is objectively good versus this is objectively evil.
Yeah, ambiguity, to take Game of Thrones as an example, is the fact that the House of the Lannisters has both Cersei, who is utterly despicable, and Tyrion, who is like a fan favorite character. It's a simple thing of when two groups come to blows, there isn't so much this sense of, oh, there's an obvious one that I want to get destroyed here, because one has been given all the good stuff and the other has been given all the bad stuff. Though I will say, as a bit of a counterpoint to this, something that the Foundation is also very good at is these kind of pure evil factions that elicit a sense of fear. There's the Children of the Scarlet King, who are like extremely menacing cultists who are always trying to usher in the big bad guy of the SCP universe. There's the Chaos Insurgency, who are the kind of scary tactical splinter cell of the Red Right Hand.
Exactly. Like, having shades of gray in your world at all doesn't mean that you can't have your, like, broadly speaking, black and your white. If you really want to do, like, pure evil or, like, pure paragon good, you should go ahead and do that. Follow your bliss. And all the shades of gray will start to be more well-defined in response to the extremes of the morality spectrum that your work presents.
You can also further flesh out the history of your world with defunct groups that existed in the past, or that might have evolved or split into the current groups, with an example on the Foundation end being the Commission on Unusual Cargo, which is the, 1600s East India company subdivision that looked into strange anomalous things on their shipping routes, or one that both me and Gus were a little bit freaked out and fascinated with, the Davites.
Yeah, the Davites are fascinating because, so, should we tell them about Davite Homer?
Yes, because I told a single commenter in the comment section of the last one about Davite Homer, and weirdly I think Davite Homer is the best way to explain the Davites to people who don't know about them, so feel free to take that one, Gus.
Yeah. Okay, so basically, because The Simpsons has been running for so long, but Homer Simpson remains the same age, his childhood moves with him through the decades. And in recent times, this has meant that Homer Simpson, a character who was an adult man in the 70s, and who I watched on television as a child in the 90s, is now a fellow 90s kid. This means that eventually, if The Simpsons continues, Homer's childhood will migrate out of my age range, and he will, as a child, be saying, "Skibbity Rizzler Gyat," and we'll just have to accept that that has always been his backstory.
Which is terrifying, and that links to, there is an SCP called SCP-140, which I must say is honestly one of my favorites in just how scary of a concept it is. It is a book called A Chronicle of the Davers, which is a history of the Davites, who, for the record, for anyone still in the dark, they were a kind of hyper-advanced but hyper-sadistic and cruel magic-practicing conquering city-state, kind of like if the Mongols had aligned themselves with the devil. This book gives the entire history of them from their inception to when they were wiped out, but every time the book is opened and closed, the Davites' endpoint becomes more recent in history, with the frightening conclusion being that if the Foundation doesn't keep this book under lock and key, reading it enough times would result in the Davite culture being reborn and likely becoming the dominant culture on Earth. which is insane and terrifying as a world-building idea.
Yeah, it's kind of like a butterfly effect type thing, except instead of like, well, wait, no, it's never the butterfly that's the bad thing. But bad things do happen.
An earthquake
Bad things
might
do
cause
happen
a butterfly.
when the past
That'd be
changes.
fucked up.
The earthquake might kill a butterfly. We can't. Or if you step on a butterfly in the past, an evil butterfly might show up in the future and conquer the world.
The anti-butterfly. It was me, Barry.
Oh my god. Leave a comment down below if you would kill the evil butterfly.
Yeah, or if you support the anti-butterfly. That should be an SCP. Hashtag I support the anti-butterfly.
I'm just imagining like Thanos being like, I used the butterfly to destroy the butterfly. I wiped out all butterflies across time so the timeline could never be changed again. Because clearly it's these things, these specific types of insect that cause this, and not just a general idea of what time travel could be like.
There's something really funny about the idea of someone who is like in a tornado or a hurricane, but they're like a massive optimist, so they're thinking, look on the bright side, this means a butterfly is batting its wings somewhere, and that must be nice to look at.
Aww.
Their house is just completely pulled away. Oh, it's awful.
Their Oklahoma home is blown away.
Oh, we're in the Davite society. So, to kind of bring all this full circle, these are the reasons why we believe that the SCP Foundation's groups of interest really take their world building to the next level, make their world feel real and tangible, and like it exists to be more than just the one, like, good guy organization up against the thousands of, like, murder monsters and anomalous people and scary cursed objects. And we would like to end this video by discussing some of the weird little groups of interest that we haven't been able to mention so far, but we just personally love, we think you should look into more, and that we just add an interesting little extra ingredient to this big world-building gumbo we got going on.
But first, we've got some shows that we would like to shout out, which are of our own creation, and also have plenty of factions within. Especially in regards to the Kingmaker Histories, which has been going on for 3 seasons, and thus has had more time to build more factions into its world. For example, there is the Valorian Socialist Republic's current regime under Holtzman that is angling for some kind of expansionist movement, and if you know anything about the historical period that this takes place in, that does not bode very well for the world, and Europe in particular. There is also Ariadne Culver, who believes that her son Leonid should definitely be on the throne, and that the Valorian Socialist Republic should be restored to a monarchy. And in and throughout that, there are a myriad other people with a myriad of other special interests that our main trio, Eisen, Winterlich, and Co., have to interact with and navigate if they're just to make money and survive in this increasingly war-torn world.
Yeah, it's a bizarre steampunk alternate history audio drama that you can find on Spotify, right here on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, anywhere that you like to listen if you want a bit of weirdness in your ears on the go. And because we spent so much time talking about the Sarkissists and the Mechanites in this video, it is also worth pointing out, if you love those particular groups just like we do, then you would love of the many groups of bizarre, like, magic, or if you want to talk about NSCP terms, thaumaturgic practitioners. There are the Fleshcrafters, which basically have the Sarkic power set, and the Artificers, which have a similar manipulation and connection with, like, inner mechanical technology. So if you love all of the alternate history, all of the weird magic, all of these different strange groups that have philosophies and powers that are equated with what they're kind of symbolic of, you're going to love the Kingmaker histories. And if your bag is less in the past and more in the weird, messed up, anomalous future, then you might enjoy our other weird audio drama podcast, Killjam Triple X.
Yes, because, well, the show is very much focused on the fictional blood sport of Killjam, which is an all-women competition full of genetically modified and cyberized competitors facing each other down, or the various pro wrestling companies and rivalries are all their own form of factions, because while our hero Faustina Fedamine has to contend with danger in and outside of the ring, her various enemies all have their own bizarre agendas and gimmicks, like any good show that would take from pro wrestling and set it in a cyberpunk future. So if you want that kind of far-flung future audio drama, we've got that show for you, Killjam Triple X. You can listen to it here on YouTube as well.
Yeah, we have a little something for everyone, and if you enjoy hearing us talk about creative work, then you'll probably get a lot out of hearing that. And one last thing before we move on to these group of interests, while we've only started speaking about it on here publicly when we felt that we had something to add to the conversation, I've actually been really immersed in the SCP Foundation and all of its lore for probably about 5 years now, and I will happily say that some of the strange, anomalous creatures and people of this world, and the real pathos that I feel for them, really influenced how I wrote Killjam, and the bizarre, fucked up workplace comedy elements of the SCP Foundation is definitely there in how I wrote the Bloodsport company, EKW, in the show. So if you're a Foundation fan, you'll probably get a kick out of that. Anyway, thank you so much for your patience hearing us talk about ourselves. Now we're going to round this out talking about a few little weird groups that we can't stop thinking about, starting with the Serpent's Hand. What do you reckon to them, Gus?
So, the Serpent's Hand are great because I feel like they could be either good guys or bad guys in contrast to the SCP Foundation story. It's all about whether or not you frame in the given narrative the idea of anomalous freedom as a virtue. Because very easily you could interpret what the Serpent Hand wants to do as wanting total chaos. They are a faction made up of people who study anomalies, seize anomalies. Many of them have anomalous abilities, and they just want a world free from consensus normality, where anomalies can simply exist unchecked and unabated, which could either be like permanent Weirdmageddon forever, or it can be a metaphor for forms of expression that are cracked down upon by authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, and I think it really is that duality that makes the Serpent's Hand so interesting, because ultimately they pose a fascinating philosophical and world-building question in that they kind of attack the very foundational element of the Foundation's existence, which is asking, why does it all have to be secret? Does it really benefit from it all being secret, or is it better for people to know so they can properly build their lives and the way we run society around them? And by the way, if you're a big fan of The Serpent's Hand and The Wanderer's Library, I will just quickly recommend a Friends audio drama, Into the Wanderer's Library, which is all about exploring that element of it. It's from Quantum Rhythm. You can find it on Spotify, and friend of the show, Theo Powers, makes that, which, as an Austin Powers fan, I can always appreciate someone whose last name is Powers. Which brings us on to Dr. Wondertainment, who is one of the stranger things out there. We've spoken on different shows on this channel, especially SpongeBob Boys, about how it's kind of obligatory for every show to have its weird Willy Wonka riff. And I think this utterly bizarre and kind of terrifying and hilarious evil toy company is a perfect example of that. And if you love the Little Misters series, that's all Dr. Wondertainment, and I think they're just a great time. They're the most zooey-pilled of any of them on here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it is one of those things where it's like, it's this perfect blend of like whimsy and capitalism. Because it's like, not only does Dr. Wondertainment know that there is like anomalies in the world and he wants to do something with them, it's also this like, and they're gonna be children's toys, and we're gonna have real children play with them for money. And it's very fun, and you can see why, like, the SCP Foundation would want to keep these toys away from the public, but you also get this sense of just like, no, these are good, like, I'm Dr. Wondertainment, I'm the fun one. I'm not like the all these other cults, I'm wholesome.
I feel like Dr. Wondertainment maybe has some interest in the Wilbur Corporation as well. That's a deep cut.
Wilbur!
Join the Patreon for $1 a month and hear Meg and Gus discuss cinematic classic Video Violence 2, among others.
Oh my god.
What a film.
Every time I close my eyes, I see Wilbur.
I'm just picturing it's the, like, Spider-Man, like, everywhere I go, I see him, and there's just a big mural of Wilbur up on the wall that he's looking up.
Oh my god.
Still with, like, blood from that's the blood of a dead child coming out of his mouth. We're truly just collapsing at this stage. But no, I think it's funny because I really enjoy that, honestly, a lot of the SCP Foundation has a real anti-capitalist streak that you can find in our work as well, whether it's like the whole Greaseburger Limited thing, or one that I love just because they're so scary is Marshall, Carter, and Dark Limited, which is definitely a Something Wicked This Way Comes reference, but they're this kind of sinister array of gentlemen's clubs and auction houses that are, like, ridiculously wealthy and well-connected and sell anomalies. And if you owe them money you can't pay back, you might end up getting turned into an anomaly and sold by them at one of their auctions.
Yeah, they're a little bit like the briefly, like, referenced and briefly center point of an arc, Black Book Club in Yu Yu Hakusho.
Yes.
Who are those, like, humans that they profit off of, like, demons in a way that makes, the actual demons seem less evil in a classic anime twist of
maybe we were the real monsters.
Humans are the real demons. Yeah.
Then, of course, there's Meg's absolute favorite, Herman Fuller's Circus of the Disquieting, and this is one that, like, some authors, like Pepper's Ghost has a lot of really good ones on there. Meg's personal special little boy, Motormouth, I'm sure we will have some pictures of Meg's Motormouth fan art on screen right now, if I remember to send them to Gus after this. Like,
please do. Don't make me look like a fool.
I remember to send them to Gus.
Hi, Meg.
I worked hard on that drawing.
Yeah, see, I'm gonna look like a complete fool if the Motormouth doesn't appear in the video, and that his whole section's been blank until now. Here's the picture. I didn't fuck up. I'm worthy of living.
We love to put little twists in the video like that. But in Herman Fuller's Circus of the Disquieting, it's a circus of weird, anomalous people. If you were a big fan of, like, those Darren Shan books as a kid, with the Cirque de Freak ones, you'll probably really enjoy this. And it's another example of how these groups of interest can really spin off into their own stories, because it's resulted in the whole Dread and Circuses hub, which is basically an AU of the Foundation at this stage, just focusing on tales and anomalies from this one group that people love so much.
It was almost inevitable that there was going to be a faction that would have the circus aesthetic, because, like, a lot of circuses throughout history have been, like, see strange and fascinating things that can't be explained, whether it's, like, performers, people with, like, different strange things about themselves, or creatures that come from, like, far and wide. So that aesthetic, I think, could really, like, work well if you, like, just take the idea of anomalies and then spin it off from this concept of, like, scientific clinical research.
Yeah, it's a wonderful both complement and opposite, and yet another one of the many places where the Foundation and the Magnus Archives cross over with the Magnus Archives Circus of the Other with Nicola Orsanov and friends. But this brings us on to our last two, which I was just explaining this second to last one to Gus before we recorded, because it's one of the more obscure ones, but it's a really cool concept. It's the Wandsmen, which are a group of interdimensional journalists who, when you become a Wandsman, you develop these like strange avian features, as well as the ability to travel across dimensions using these like anomalous multiversal maps. And they are nominally aligned with the Foundation just because they don't ever want reality to be destroyed, because if reality is destroyed, they'll have nothing to report on.
It's always fun to have a faction that is just interested in, like, getting information out there, and, like, you know, giving you, like, a default, like, this is the news anchor who will be, like, you know, helping with exposition in, like, your little narrative thing.
And lastly, but not leastly, I also have a soft spot in my heart for Are We Cool Yet? Because there's something really fun about a group of like weird renegade artists or anomalous artists who are making these freaky reality bending art installations to make a point, and occasionally just causing lots of death in the process, especially if you're looking at the canon where they were the ones who invented SCP-173, aka the sculpture, aka the original SCP ever created, as you'll know from our last video, and that just really brings the whole thing full circle. If there's any other permutations of SCP discussion content that you'd love to see from us, please let us know. Ditto for any other weird internet stuff. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. I've been Henry Galley.
And I've been Gus Agarella, and we will SCP you in the near future.